statue before you is unique, and that is the only one in the United States Army recognizing a modern female warrior. Lieutenant Farmer, as she is affectionately known, stands in tribute to all women who have served and who are currently serving in defense of our nation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and great pleasure to introduce to you Brigadier General John E. O'Neill.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with such a distinguished group on a uniquely special day in our history as an Army. I want to recognize a few folks right up front, in particular the museum staff, the staff of the Combined Arms Support Command, the Quartermaster School, the Garrison, the Friends of the Army Women's Museum Association, and in particular our historical interpreters who volunteered to participate in this ceremony in a very unique and important way to represent the history of women in uniform in service to our Army. So for those that helped put together this magnificent event, will you please join me in a round of applause for them, please? Thank you. You know, I was absolutely inspired the very first time I toured this museum, I guess about 14 months ago or so. And it wasn't simply the artifacts, the archives, the displays, although they do tell some important and unique stories, but it was also the professional staff and how they told those stories that really touched me. And I'll just share with you on a personal note the level of influence that women have had in my life. You know, there's a family of first cousins on the O'Neill side, and there were 5 girls all in a row. And in my immediate family, 3 first children were girls. And legend has it that Dad offered the doctor a case of champagne to come out with a boy. So, and here I am. But it was my grandmother who convinced me to join the ROTC program and ultimately the Army. The last assignment I had prior to coming here to Fort Lee to be the Quartermaster General, I had the good fortune to work for the first female 4-star general in the history of our Army, and that was General Ann Dunwoody down at Army Materiel Command. And she joined the Army in '75, and I in '86. General Dunwoody was a trailblazer and did many firsts for women in our Army. Only 11 years of separation between the beginnings of our career, and yet I have worked directly for 5 different female officers in my career. And that to me is important to recognize in terms of a shift and a change in the ever-growing role of women leading our Army. Ladies and gentlemen, this museum here is a national treasure. It's one of a kind, the only one in our Army, in any Army in the world. And I would tell you that in an era of accelerated change of the women's role in combat, where we have seen just incredible things, right? Female engagement teams, combat leadership roles, training Afghan and Iraqi national security forces, holding leadership positions never before held. This rate of change is just absolutely unparalleled in our nation's history, in my estimate, notwithstanding the contributions of, you know, Rosie the Riveter. But you know, perhaps one day Lieutenant Fama here will be known as well as Rosie, because she does represent a connection between our predecessors and those women that have served over the generations in the 238-year history of our Army. I often refer to this museum as a training and education center, because that's what they do. And they leverage the past to shape the future of our Army profession. Every artifact, every display, Every archive tells a story of a soldier making a difference in our Army. And those stories are shared with myriad audiences. They're shared with local students. 10,000 students this past year from kindergarten through 12th grade have received some training and education here in the Women's Museum. With community leaders, local businesses, the museum staff expertly conducts human resource and leadership programs on diversity and equal opportunity for Walmart Distribution Center and Old Dominion and many, many others. So in many ways, they're leading a cultural change, not just within our Army ranks, but also in our American culture. And I think that's important. You know, years from now, our Army and our nation is going to reflect back upon the impact of this prolonged war that we've been fighting, and they'll absolutely marvel at the incredible legacy of women leading change in our Army. This statue dedicated today links our women veterans of the past to the current generation, and it is the only statue recognizing the service of Army women located on an Army post. And how fitting that Lieutenant Fama stand guard over Fort Lee, once referred to as the Island of Integration, one of the first posts in which we had all-female formations, to include certainly in those leadership positions. In fact, I met a World War II first sergeant from back in the day, right? That luncheon was a great idea, and I thank the association for hosting that because, again, it gave us an opportunity to mix and mingle and become reacquainted and share some stories. And so thank you so much for all of you for sharing the moment, to share such an important moment so close to Veterans Day, to thank our women in uniform for their leadership of the Army. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Director of the United States Army Women's Museum, Dr. Francois Bonnell.
Well, thank you, General O'Neill, for such a wonderful and meaningful comments. And, sir, your support of the museum and the passion that you have for its history challenges us every day to be better at what we do. So, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished visitors, it is a great pleasure to have you with us today to celebrate Veterans Day and to unveil our modern female warrior statue. The museum staff began this project many, many months ago. And here at the museum, we are privileged to work with America's finest young men and women in uniform. And daily, we're inspired by their commitment and their accomplishments. We wanted to recognize their service and also help them see their place in history. And so the museum staff suddenly felt like we had a mission. That is, the statue is a mission. And it was Ron Bingham, who's over here, the collection manager for the museum. He's really the one that had a vision of what the statue should look like and how she should be represented. The one thing the museum staff all agreed on was that Lieutenant Fama should stand as proof of the Army's investment in and commitment to women in its ranks, as well as the promise of its future. Well, we immediately approached the Friends of the Army Women's Museum Association and asked if they would be willing to support the project. They were very, very enthusiastic about it and did not hesitate at all to commit this idea and to help us make it become a reality. Well, the first thing we had to do, of course, was to create a concept. We did agree that the statue should be modern, perhaps someone who might have joined in the last decade or two. We wanted her to be a warrior who serves her country with the ideals of the Army's warrior ethos. We also wanted to make sure that she represented not only the active Army, but also our citizen soldiers of the Army Reserve and National Guard. So our challenge was set out ahead of us because, of course, we had to answer the question, what should she look like and what should she wear? No easy task. Well, we had Sergeant First Class Williams, who was the EO here at Fort Lee. She's back there in the row, who had deployed twice to Iraq. She'd spent a lot of time in the museum helping us on various projects. And we asked her one day just to model the gear for us. And she was very excited to do that. In fact, she ran home and got her own gear and brought it in for us. And what we found out is that in itself was an education for the museum staff. But it was also an example of how challenging it is to capture history as it happens. Well, we asked Sergeant First Class Rankin. She was here visiting the museum many months ago, and she had a perfectly done hair bun. And so we asked her if we could photograph that, and that actually became the hairstyle for the statue. Well, we gathered the uniform and the equipment, and we shipped them off to a studio where the artist then selected a model of the mold. And Command Sergeant Major Sims, the Command Sergeant Major of the Combined Arms Support Command, he's with us here also today, helped us to ensure that the model wore the equipment correctly, and by inspecting photographs sent back and forth between the New York studio. And then finally, Ron, ingenious as he is, got a hold of a retired colonel and non-commissioned officer from Fort Hamilton and asked them to drive over to Brooklyn, New York to the Kodiak studios to make every last possible final inspection. So we're pretty proud of what she looks like, and you'll see soon. Well, when Lieutenant Fama finally arrived at the museum in September, she's been here a little while, wanted to make sure she didn't miss her own event, we realized that her impact was far greater than what we had expected. Where Pallas Athene, who you'll see, of course, in front of the museum, is really the anchor of the history in the museum, this statue will be the bridge to the future. She was placed specifically here so that she could be seen from a distance, and we hope that she will beckon people to the museum to learn about the contributions that women have made to the Army since 1775. So Lieutenant Fama now symbolizes the significance of this generation and the unprecedented changes in the role of women taking place in the Army today. And we want to thank you, the museum staff, Friends of the Army Women's Museum Association. We want to thank everybody for making this project possible. It was a true team effort, and true in the sense of all the true of word can be for teamwork. So I just want to thank you all, and thank you all for being here again today.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the Army's Women's Museum Association, Lieutenant Colonel Retired, Pat Sigel.
Good afternoon. General O'Neill, distinguished guests, soldiers and veterans of our great Army, ladies and gentlemen. During the American Revolution, a British officer stated the following to Lord Charles Cornwallis, Brigadier General of the British Army South. Even if I destroy all the men in North America, we should still have to conquer the women. Wise beyond his years. His sentiments were reiterated a century and a half later by General Dwight D. Eisenhower in a personal note which was hand-carried to the Chairman, House Armed Services Committee. He was urging speedy approval of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1947, which would allow women to continue to serve in the Women's Army Corps, as they were known as WACs. General Eisenhower wrote, "My experience in the use of WACs covers both wartime and peacetime conditions, both overseas and in the zone of interior. That experience has convinced me that a modern Army must have WACs. Modern warfare places our future as close to the firing line as Europe's past. That means that the women of America must share the responsibility for the security of their country in a future emergency, as the women of England did in World War II. I heartily support and urge speedy recovery, approval of the congressional bill to integrate women into the regular Army and organized reserve corps." The bill passed, and WACs went on to serve in Korea and Vietnam. In 1978, I was a lieutenant in the Women's Army Corps when it was disestablished after being a part of the Army for more than 30 years. While this decision was necessary for the advancement of Army women, it was bittersweet for those of us who wore with pride the Women's Army Corps insignia and what we had accomplished. We took off the insignia of Pallas Athene, and we took on the responsibility of moving the Army forward into a truly integrated institution. Many WAC veterans who played a part in this history sit amongst us today. These ladies represent the many women who were the original all-volunteer Army. Please join me in a round of applause to recognize their service. To our female soldiers serving today, you stand on our shoulders. You make us so proud. Your continued outstanding service and accomplishment of the mission will also provide future generations of women the ability to serve our Army and this great nation. For almost 40 years, I have loved and served this museum and its predecessor in Alabama. Most Army museums have a nonprofit organization like FALMA to provide monetary and volunteer support. Ours is a labor of love. This association has played a critical role in helping fund museum projects. We are a hands-on, roll-up-your-sleeves organization dedicated to preserving Army women's history. I call upon all to support this museum, for without your grandmothers, mothers, aunts, sisters, and daughters' service, our Army would not be the best in the world. We need you to help us help the museum preserve Army women's history. You can do this in a number of ways. Think about volunteering your time, making a financial contribution, sharing your story, or maybe a story of someone else, or even donating your collection. The best gift you could give is to spread the word about this beautiful, remarkable, one-of-a-kind museum. General O'Neill, Dr. Bonnell, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Friends of the Army Women's Museum Association and our supporters, we are overflowing with pride for our sister soldiers and are extremely pleased to honor their service and sacrifice to our country with this statue. From the Be All You Can Be generation to the Army Strong generation. Hooah!
Thank you, Pat, and thank you to the Friends of the Army Women's Museum Association for doing everything you do for us and for Army women. Well, before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to share a little bit of history with you. And I think the history will better understand the service of Army women today and also the history of this statue. The defense of our nation has been undertaken by men and women standing shoulder to shoulder for more than 2 centuries. And women's contributions to the Army are intertwined with American history, and their story of courage and loyalty began in the creation of the Army in 1775. If you look to my left, your right, you will see 16 non-commissioned officers, all from the 23rd Quartermaster Brigade and its 3 battalions in the departments, who volunteered to be an historical interpreter today. And they proudly wear uniforms of their predecessors, recognizing the generations of Army trailblazers. Through the first 2 centuries of our nation's history, women served courageously during every conflict, to include the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. In fact, it's the typhoid fever of that particular conflict that led to the creation of the Army Nurse Corps in 1901. In World War I, there were women who were contracted as telephone operators, reconstruction aides, drivers. They worked for the quartermaster and the ordnance departments as well. But it's really not until World War II that we see the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, shortly thereafter the Women's Army Corps. Through the course of the war, over 140,000 Army women will serve, and 250,000 total in all of the branches. In fact, today we are honored to have several World War II veterans with us. We have Miss Gilchrist, and they are here in the front, Miss Lloyd, and Miss Young, who was one of the very, very first recruits into the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and we're very, very honored to have you today, and I'd like to give you a round of applause. Originally, the Women's Army Corps was created to last for the duration of the war plus 6 months. However, the contributions and the accomplishments of these women were recognized with the passage of the Women's Armed Service Integration Act of 1948, and that established a permanent WAC that allowed women to serve in the regular Army, the Army Reserve, and eventually in the Army National Guard. The first training center of the permanent WAC was located here at Fort Lee. This is one of the reasons why this museum was moved from Fort McClellan, Alabama, to Fort Lee. Between 1948 and 1954, thousands of WACs were trained here. And these women were instrumental in helping the Army overcome the challenges of racial integration that was ordered by the President in 1948. In fact, years before the Civil Rights Movement, Fort Lee's WAC school here was known as an island of integration. And this was an island of integration in a sea of segregation. And two of these veterans are with us today, Miss Beasley and Miss Reese, who are here, who are very much part of that history that allowed us then to move the WAC even further forward. So I'd like to give them a round of applause too. A new WAC center was opened at Fort McClellan, Alabama in 1955. And that center would train tens of thousands of WACs over the next 3 decades. During the Vietnam War, 8,000 Army nurses and 800 WACs served as well. In fact, today we have Flo Dunn, who's here in the front, who served in Vietnam and she was stationed in Saigon. So thank you, Flo, for your service as well. And many more women during that time would support the war effort. And we have Rowena Carter also, who served during that time. So, give her. When the draft was discontinued after the Vietnam War, the ranks of the WAC grew dramatically in response to the needs of the Army. The Women's Army Corps went through many changes, but all served with great pride. And we have amongst us, as Pat had mentioned, many members of the Women's Army Corps. But the president of the Women's Army Corps Veterans Association, Vicki Hayduke, and Margaret Hunter, who is the captain of the WAC Honor Guard, and many other numerous individuals from the chapters around the country have traveled very long distances to join us. And we thank you for being here, and we thank you for your legacy and your service. In 1975, the United States military academies were directed to open their doors to females. And the first group of women entered West Point in 1976. But with the onset of the women's movement, the Army began to reassess its gender policies and increased opportunities for women in uniform. These changes led to the Congressional Act of 1978 that disestablished the Women's Army Corps. So that first gender-integrated class from West Point was commissioned into the regular Army in 1980 and ushered in an era of greater opportunities for women in training, assignments, and promotions. And in the ensuing years, the Army was called upon to respond to regional conflicts, natural disasters, and humanitarian crises around the globe. The roles of Army women were tested and redefined during these contingency operations. And the ranks of the women in the Army Reserve and the National Guard expanded rapidly in the 1980s. In 1990, 1991, Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, at that time the largest call-up of Army women since World War II, proved that the Army had successfully integrated women into its ranks. But it also created a heated national debate about women's roles in combat, a debate that would not be resolved until the dawn of the 21st century. It's the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 that mark a pivotal changing point for Army women. As the Army's needs changed on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, so did the role of women in their ranks. This transformation took place in both job type and location, with women now being placed alongside men in direct combat units. Army doctrine acknowledges that women can play an integral and definitive role, and with the rescinding of the combat exclusion policy and the opening of thousands of positions that were previously closed, modern Army women are afforded opportunities that were inconceivable to their predecessors. And our guest speaker today is Sergeant First Class Charlanda Moss. Her service in the Army spans 2 decades, and she's personally experienced many of those transformations. Sergeant Moss joined the Army in 1992, shortly after Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. She participated in contingency operations, specifically Restore Hope in Haiti in 1994, and she was later assigned to an engineer battalion at Camp Castle, Korea. She's been deployed in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Sergeant Moss has challenged herself throughout her Army career. As a young Spec 4, newly assigned to Fort Campbell, she graduated from the Air Assault School. And in 2005, Sergeant First Class Moss came to Fort Lee to train as a 92 Whiskey, or a water treatment specialty, a military occupational specialty that contains few women. And in 2012, Sergeant First Class Moss was inducted into the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club, as you can see from the medallion she's wearing around her neck. And the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club is a group whose members reflect the highest ideals of Army service, dedication, leadership, and professionalism. In many ways, Sergeant First Class Moss's Army service reflects all of the aspects that we strove in order to illustrate and to create this statue. In fact, the day that it arrived, within minutes that it had been unpacked, she came by with the CASCOM Command Sergeant Majors to see it. And when she looked at First Lieutenant Fama for the very first time, she broke out into the biggest smile we had ever seen. So it is fitting that she's here with us today, and I would like to welcome Sergeant First Class Moss as our guest speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Bunnell, for that gracious introduction. Brigadier General O'Neill, Command Sergeant Major Sims, Command Sergeant Major Gray, other distinguished guests, community leaders, soldiers, families, and friends. I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to speak this afternoon. Today is another example of how the Army is recognizing female warriors, and I am super excited to be a part of such a momentous occasion. When I think about the significance of today, I think about the big picture. The big picture being females have always been warriors. As an Army woman of today, I have witnessed female warriors standing in foxholes, sleeping in the same tent as our male warriors, sharing the same restrooms, and being the best gunner an organization could ever have. My perspective is the expectation in war is the same for female warriors as it is for male warriors. We are prepared to perform and execute just as our male counterparts. I am overjoyed that someone finally realized that we don't need a combat exclusion policy anymore. Now I can go and become that ranger that I always wanted to be. Not really, just kidding. But I am glad to see the barriers broken and the walls removed for women in the military. I'm so elated to be here and to tell you just a piece of my story. I'm no different from anyone else. I haven't broken any world records. I'm just another soldier with a story. I'm grateful to be able to share with you today. I remember when I first signed into my unit at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. You all know it as 101st Airborne Division Air Assault. I was there only 3 days when my first sergeant asked me during PT to climb the rope. Some of you know where I'm going with this. So I watched someone climb, and I observed how they did the feet lock method with the rope and decided to give it a try. I climbed to the top of that rope, and as I was figuring out how I was going to get down, my first sergeant yelled up to me and said, "Specialist Moss, you're going to air assault school tomorrow." My natural response was, "Whoa, first sergeant." I was a nervous wreck. I asked my squad leader, what exactly is air assault school? And what am I supposed to expect? My squad leader looked at me and shrugged his shoulders and said, "Moss, I don't know, I've never gone." Needless to say, that next morning I got up and blindly reported to air assault school at old dark 30. It had to be 200 to 300 soldiers scrambling around in the dark, forming several teams, trying to make our way through the obstacle course, better known as 0 Day. I quickly learned that if we were loud and motivated, Our smoke sessions wouldn't be so aggressive. As you know, we were at 101st Airborne Division, so that would mean 101 jumping jacks, 101 overhand arm claps, 101 squat benders. We were going to need our energy to complete this obstacle course. I would tap and pull my battle buddies along, screaming and yelling, "Hurry up, let's work together." And most of all, sound off. As the sun began to rise, and I was able to truly see and make out who my battle buddies were, I realized that the battle buddy to my left was a lieutenant colonel, and the battle buddy to my right was a sergeant first class. I looked at them with an apologetic grin, and they both gave me a thumbs up. I'm sure they thought this specialist was crazy. As I took a moment to look around at the hundreds of faces going through the obstacle course, I realized that it was the first time that I had experienced soldiers of different ranks, officers, warrant officers, non-commissioned officers, and junior enlisted, all in the same school setting with the same common goal. You have to be mindful, this was only the second Army course that I had been to, the first being the Warrior Leaders course, and we were all the same rank. As I looked further around the obstacle, I started to wonder how many females were here. I saw 3, a first lieutenant, a sergeant first class, and a specialist. I was the one of the 3. We made it through 0 day, and 10 days later, we all graduated from the only, the real, the true Air Assault School, the Sawalowski Air Assault School. So like I said in the beginning, females have always been warriors. Several years later, and many duty assignments thereafter, I returned back to Fort Campbell. Now I'm a brand new staff sergeant. My battalion command sergeant major, who I swear was the brother of the air assault instructor or air assault school, first sergeant that told me to go to air assault school, said, "Staff Sergeant Moss, you're good at PT. I'm sending you over to be a warrior leader course instructor. Report to John Krekel NCO Academy." My natural response was, "Whoa, Sergeant Major." Here I go again. Boy, was I terrified, but I was ready to accept the challenge. There were over 45 male instructors, all bearing combat arm MOSs, from Rangers to infantrymen to scouts, and only 3 females. I would make the 4th. I clearly had something to prove. The intent was to have 1 female instructor per platoon. I met my 11 Bravo partner, and he explained to me that most platoons had a system. The male instructors would teach combat operations, and the female instructors would teach evaluation reports, equal opportunity, suicide prevention, etc. I looked my new partner in his big green eyes, and I said, "That's not how I roll. I want to know everything you know, partner." He mumbled something about me being a feminist. From that moment on, I knew that he was anything but thrilled to have me on board, and granted, I wasn't thrilled to have him as a partner either. He didn't seem to understand that me, the soldier that I am, I wanted to be able to perform and execute just as my male battle buddy. And over time, he taught me everything there was to know, from squad movement techniques to combat and tactical operations. He even saved me from having my hand blown off from a grenade simulator. What a newfound respect we both gained for each other. We truly became battle buddies. The professional relationship that we gained was such a positive impact on our platoon. It was such a great balance being able to assist my partner and other male instructors in my platoon to understand things such as the wear and appearance of female soldier standards, hair and nail standards, and the proper wear of the female dress uniform. And they, in return, assisted me in being the best grunt that I could be. The biggest transformation I observed was watching the male instructors initially be very hesitant to engage with the female students. But over time, they were taking on unique issues and concerns and handling them successfully without fail. The impact was huge. As a soldier, I left changed, and I hope that the NCO Academy was changed as well. While being here at Fort Lee, I've had the pleasure of working for and meeting some wonderful female warriors. I remember last year during Women's History Month, Fort Lee hosted the first ever all-female, all-star panel. This panel consisted of 10 female general officers who discussed education and their operational experiences. I had the distinct pleasure of introducing two of the generals, Major General Heidi Brown and Brigadier General Janice Hagler. What a great honor. I felt like I was out of place or out of space seeing so many stars in one location. It was so phenomenal to have such an opportunity to learn from the experiences of some very accomplished female warriors. Then there was Brigadier General Promotable Bingham. Never in a million years did I think that I would have the privilege to work for an outstanding female warrior. As you all know, she was the first female Quartermaster General, and now she is the first woman commander at White Sands Missile Range. I've never seen someone who could work until 1900 or 2000 hours and come in the next morning with a fresh baked chocolate cake. I thought to myself, does she ever sleep? Then I remember she wasn't just a female warrior. She was a female gladiator, and gladiators as herself never sleep. I remember her always saying to me, you have to be relevant and value added. That stuck with me from the first time I heard her say it. She was just that, and the chocolate cake was just an added touch. Relevant and value added is what Lieutenant Fama represents to me. And as I stand here today thinking about those two qualities, the impact of this statue is breathtaking. It reminds me of the great female leaders whose shoulders I stand upon, some of which I spoke of. And if you don't remember anything I said this afternoon, please keep this as a mental note. On behalf of all of today's women in the military, continue to look past our gender. Give us a chance. You will be amazed. We are a force multiplier. Our perception, drive, purpose, and motivation has always proven to be relevant and value added. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So you're going to pick her up on the podium. This is so great. Well, we knew Sergeant Moss was super. We didn't know she was super, but thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And I have the privilege of giving her today a token of thanks for being the guest speaker. And it is fresh and hot off the press, so to speak, right out of the mold. And it is a copy of the statue and the new modern female warrior. So you have to come over this way. You have to come around to me this way. So I hope you'll hang on to her. Think about today. And remember, we appreciate everything you and all female warriors do for the Army.
Thank you so much.
You can just stand there for a minute. Well, the time has come. So, sir, Lieutenant Fama is ready to report for duty. If you will join me.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, the official party and Sergeant First Class Retired Ronald Bigham will now join Dr. Burnell to the unveiling of the Female Warrior statue. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the playing of the Army song. The words are located in your program.
Sing a song.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the formal portion of the ceremony.